Let's continue discussing life history strategies observed within vernal pool species. Some of the species are selected species, and then on the other hand, we have a few case selected species as well. But most of the vernal pool occupants belong to the R selected strategy. Now, by this time, but at this stage, I expect all the students to know what R selection and K selection is, because one of the prereqs for this course is to have a basic ecology knowledge. So if you don't, you have to follow it up on your own. Um, so R selected species, what characterizes them? They produce large number of eggs, right, or large number of young, um, and most of the young produced are going to be smaller in size because large they are produced in large numbers. And among amphibians, the examples are wood frogs, American toads, and Fowler's toads. So all of those species produce eggs in massive numbers. It could be in the range of hundreds to thousands, and they during the early in the season, fairly early in the season, all of them reproduce um, in massive numbers in synchrony, where all of the individuals visit the vernal pool during a very short period of time and reproduce. For example, like wood frogs finish reproduction within a matter of weeks, right? Or actually less than a week in certain cases. Um, Toads, the American and Fowler's toads, could wrap up their reproductive efforts also within a week or so, right? So all the individuals, all the members that are reproductively active in that local population will reproduce in synchrony at the same time. When you look at the case-selected species, they actually produce few eggs, but each egg or each young that they produce are much larger in size. Marbled salamander is an example. Um, And in addition, some of the species that associate vernal pools are long-lived adults, right? That lives more than a single year, multiple years, right? And some of those can actually forego reproduction in certain seasons and only reproduce intermittently. In between the actually reproducing seasons, these adults could actually assimilate energy or energy reserves required for reproduction. And iteroparity is also observed among some of those long-lived adults. In fact, all of those long-lived adults actually have iteroparity. Iteroparity, by definition, is um, breeding multiple times during one's life cycle. Mole salamander is an example. Now, complex life cycles or complex life histories are characterized by these vernal pool occupants, meaning they have multiple life history stages that have different niche requirements um, or different biological attributes. And species that have complex life cycle actually have highly mobile adults that actually migrate to vernal pools across a long range that actually crisscrosses landscapes. And also, when the neonates emerge as an adult from the vernal pool, they also disperse long distances. And I did mention about the reproductive synchrony with vernal pool hydrology briefly, actually many times, and at the beginning of this slide as well. So, meaning, what does that mean? Species synchronize their reproductive efforts, their mating efforts, egg laying efforts with the hydrology of the pool, right? When pool starts filling up with rainwater or snow melt or spring feds, right? Immediately species starts breeding, right? They migrate to the pond, they mate, they start emitting their reproductive calls, and they oviposit. So that's a very interesting coincidence between biological activities and physical activities. Biological activity is breeding related behavior. Physical activity is pond flooding. Oh. And then, so in contrast to the long lived adults I explained, um, There are also species with short lifespans, right, that actually undergo very rapid, fast development and early maturity. So those individuals, those adults, produce large number of eggs, and those eggs are also drought tolerant, and so they only hatch after the flooding. So meaning, if a particular vernal pool does not flood, those eggs can actually bypass that particular season, right? And differential hatching flooding, meaning, like, what do you mean by differential hatching after flooding? Meaning, they not the entire batch of eggs hatch immediately after flooding, right? Certain eggs hatch immediately after flooding, and some of them actually remain dormant, maybe for the later season, or maybe it will remain dormant for the entire season and starts hatching if flooded um, in the subsequent season. So that's what you mean by differential hatching after flooding. It's kind of um, there's a sequence of hatching within the season or across multiple seasons. And for certain species, breeding efforts can continuously happen, one after the other, one after the other, without interruptions, if water availability is guaranteed, right? If water does not draw down, reproduction can happen continuously. Particularly for species with shorter life cycles, with rapid development and early reproductive maturity, that is the way it's going on, right? And for the same species, if pond dries down, when the standing water is no longer available, they immediately become dormant or undergo estivation, right? Where they actually spend the rest of their time inactively in the vernal pool basin, underneath the sediments. And then again, if the pool fills in, if there's standing water, reproduction immediately kicks in, right? So, because of this rapid development and rapid turnover, these kind of species, particularly invertebrates, they can complete multiple generations within a single year in a given vernal pool. Now let's talk about the different types of life history strategies that you find among species occupying vernal pools. Now, I'm going to go over several strategies here. Do not consider these strategies to be mutually exclusive. Some of them are, of course, but as you try to understand the definition of these strategies, you will realize that some of them actually overlap. Persistent species, meaning species that are always going to be present in the vernal pool, right, during when it is wet as well as when it is dry, right? If it is wet, it's going to be on the water column. If it is dry, it's going to be in the substrate, in the sediments. Second group, um, emerge on vernal pool species. So they actually emerge immediately after flooding or filling of the vernal pool. So most of these species, they remain dormant, inactive in the basin, in the dry basin, and upon flooding, they completely, kind of revert back to an active form and complete their life cycle before the pond dries down in a matter of 4 to 6 weeks. Um, and then late spring species takes about 2 to 5 weeks for them to reach the vernal pool, for them to colonize the vernal pool after flooding. And then, so these species actually don't stay in the vernal pool, in the dry basin. They migrate to the vernal pool for the purpose of breeding. The life cycle is going to be about a month or so. And and then you have the drying phase species. Those are the species that actually colonize the vernal pool or starts occupying the vernal pool about 2 to 3 weeks before the complete drawdown of that particular pond. Um, and they have actually the fastest life cycles, fastest developmental phases. And most of those species are actually going to be invertebrates. The last one, the dry phase species, that actually become active only after the pond is completely dried down. And most of those species are going to be plants that can occur in dry, moist, not dry, the drawdown, get moist, humid um, substrates or humid soil of the vernal pool substrate. Based on the life histories I explained you before, you can also divide vernal pool communities into two forms: permanent occupants and migrants. So migrants are the breeders. They're the breeding. The migration or the migrants could reach or access the vernal pool for breeding purposes or for other life history functions that are not related to breeding directly. For example, certain species, particularly vertebrates like turtles and snakes and birds, visit vernal pools for the purpose of foraging, looking for food. Um, as a thermal refuge, particularly during summer when the rest of the uplands are hotter, right? Certain animals could reach the vernal pool as a thermal refuge just to cool themselves down, particularly when vernal pools are spring fed or groundwater fed. Those waters tends to be warmer and stable, so it makes a really good thermal refuge. Or as a stepping stone, when certain wetland dependent species migrate or disperse, they could use vernal pools as kind of a stopover or a stepping stone during their lives, during their migratory pathway. And migrants spend much of their life cycle in habitats that are not vernal pools. It could be other wetlands that are not necessarily vernal pools, other aquatic habitats like rivers or lakes and ponds, or forests or grasslands. Um, so the overall fitness of these migrants that are occupying vernal pools transiently um, depends on both local and landscape scale features, particularly for the migrants to successfully finish their life cycles and to reach vernal pools for breeding activities, um, and even for certain species to reach vernal pools for foraging activities. The, the, the habitat continuity, connectivity is extremely important. Lack of disturbances is also important across the landscape for these guys to migrate. Permanent residents, they spend their entire life cycle and complete all the life history functions in the vernal pool, right? So for their fitness, the landscape scale features matters quite very little, right? Mostly the fitness is coming from the local scale features. We look back at the migration, that need to be addressed in detail. So migration happens across long distances. So the long distance, when I say long distance, I cannot, and I'm not going to give you an absolute number because the distance, whether it's long or short, depends on the body size of the animal in concern, right? For a small as for a small frog like a wood frog, if it is migrating over a couple of kilometers, that's a long distance, right? And migration is performed seasonally in response to environmental signals, particularly warming temperature, increasing daylight length, things like that. The purpose of migration is could be in search of food, in search of profitable feeding grounds, or in search of favorable climatic conditions, weather conditions, in search of climatic refugia, right, or avoiding unfavorable conditions, right, or for the purpose of reproduction, for the purpose of mating, for the purpose of laying eggs, and seeking suitable habitats for the larval development. Now, migration, needless to say, is only performed by animals. Plants do not migrate, plants disperse. Most often, migration is known to take the same pathway. Now, this is particularly true for most of the birds that are migrating um, across different wetland habitats, but for pond breeding amphibians, we don't know how much true that is. That's kind of a conjecture, a guess, rather than factually validated. Um, and whenever they do migrate along the same pathway, those animals could use different a combination of cues. It could include magnetic fields, the Earth's magnetic field, could use the stellar maps, right? Kind of the orienting themselves based on um, other celestial bodies, and with respect to orientation to the sun, or using other landmarks, particularly hydrologic features like other wetlands and streams in the landscape. So a term that is has been always mistakenly interpreted that is related to vernal pool ecology is dispersal, right? Um, it's not the same as migration. It's very similar, related, but not the same. Dispersal is movement of individuals from their natal grounds to other habitats to complete the rest of the life histories, to complete the rest of the life cycle. Now, the idea of dispersal is to search or access habitats that are suitable for those dispersing individuals to colonize, to grow, to reach sexual maturity, and so that subsequently they can successfully reproduce. Now, dispersal help increase or measure or kind of dispersal is actually a currency of an individual's fitness, right? Individuals that can disperse further distances can have higher fitness, um, and also prevents dispersal help prevents um, inbreeding depression, right? So it increases breeding amongst less related individuals, right? Because if you do not disperse further away from your natal grounds, chances are that you might breed with your first order cousins, with your siblings, with more related individuals, with individuals coming from the same cohort. But if you disperse further away, the probability of two individuals from the same cohort breeding is minimized. So hence, dispersal enhances outbreeding, which is important to increase genetic diversity within the population. And dispersal is how you can also increase gene flow. That's how certain relatively isolated subpopulations can exchange genes amongst each other, which also enhances the survival of the populations, increases the fitness of the overall population. Um, Dispersal is an active function. In certain literature, it actually suggests there's kind of a decision-making process, right? Particularly for species that tend to have some sort of a phenotypic plasticity. Um, and Opposite of dispersal is phylopatry. Phylopatry means the preference to stay within their natal ground, so in the vicinity of their natal ground. So certain species actually gravitate against dispersal, right? And some of them are vernal pool occupants. But most vertebrate vernal pool occupants are not phylopatric. They disperse into other habitats, to other environments to complete their rest of the life cycle. So let's talk a little bit about breeding migrants that associate vernal pools for the purpose of reproduction. Amphibians are the best example, mole salamanders and wood frogs, right? Um, there have, for quite a while, until up until recently, there was a strong consensus that breeding amphibians have a very high site fidelity. What does that mean? Means that mig- these migrants repeatedly keep coming back to the same natal habitats for breeding, and successive generations keep returning to the same habitat for breeding, like salmons do. Um, so, for this particular purpose, adults that dispersed over great distances to other habitats will migrate back over long distances to their natal pond. In fact, about 80 to 90% of the wood frogs are believed to return to their natal habitats. And well, what is the benefit of evolving some kind of a behavior like this? What is the evolutionary advantage of this kind of a response? Well, first, it increases the reproductive success, because if a particular generation were able to finish their life cycle successfully and survive up to the reproductive stage, meaning that particular habitat has some good qualities um, for the purpose of reproduction, egg hatching, and larval growth. So maybe that's one reason. Secondarily, migrating back over long distances to the natal ground is an endeavor. It requires traveling, crisscrossing extensive grounds. So the survive so it kind of enforces a test, right? Kind of tests you on the survival of the fittest, right? Only the fittest can migrate back. If you are not fit enough, you will not survive the entire trip, so you will die before that, so hence you will not get to reproduce. So it's kind of a generates a selection pressure. um well, are there any downsides? Yes, with the development, with the habitat modifications, some of those natal grounds could be completely destroyed, right? Completely draw down, right? um with the climate change going on, certain ponds may not fill up or may not actually have hydro period long enough, right? And if individuals within a one generation, all of them return as adults to the same ground, there will be inbreeding happening. um so there are disadvantages to that one too. So and also, how can you increase the genetic diversity if only if 80 to 90% returns to the same pond? Well, the 10 to 20% that disperses away are the ones that are responsible for increasing genetic diversity. But now, I earlier mentioned when I started talking about this high site fidelity, this was believed historically in past times. Now we do have evidence suggesting that this kind of a phenomena where the high site fidelity is observed is a more of a local phenomena. Certain populations may have high site fidelity, some of them may not. In fact, more populations will um, be more neophilic than philopatric. They will not return to the same habitat. They may actually seek alternative habitats. So some studies that actually have created artificial or constructed vernal pools within a single season, those were colonized by all the possible vernal pool occupants or pond breeding amphibians available in the local or regional species pool. So there is actually um, so the high site fidelity is a very rare phenomenon. That's what we believe right now. But nonetheless, it's interesting that at least in some populations they show this high fidelity. Um, this behavior is observed also among certain invertebrates like flies that overwinter in the woodlands and certain parasitic arthropods. Um, and some of these breeding migrants can actually kind of hitchhike other animals, right? Um, for example, plants do that. How plants colonize back and forth, how plants migrate back and forth between vernal pools is not by actively migrating, they are hitchhiking on animals' bodies, right? Certain small uh, seeds can actually hitchhike in birds' feathers, right? So these are wood frogs, like one of the most iconic species of the vernal pool environment. One of my favorite species. Um, the left one is a male, which is much more darker in coloration, and the brighter colored one is a female. And the photograph does not tell you this. The female tends to be much larger than the male, and that is actually a vernal pool egg mass. So they actually those single individual eggs like are laid as a mass, right, by the amplexing female, and it's usually attached to some sort of a twig, as you see in the bottom figure, right, and then the development happens afterward within the water. um, and that is actually a tadpole. Those tadpoles are extremely small. um, and kind of a cool identification feature is that the golden speckling you see in the head of the tadpole is quite characteristic of wood frog tadpoles. So wood frogs tend to lay eggs, or tend to lay egg masses in a single location. So right now we are looking at like a massive aggregation of egg masses. So this is called a raft. So in a given vernal pool, usually multiple females lay eggs in the same location, right? It could be maybe that microclimatically that area is more favorable for egg laying, and they produce. And in a single raft, you could find 30 or more egg masses. I personally have found in certain occasions nearly 100 egg masses, over 50 egg masses in a single location, in a single raft. And these egg masses, the ones you are looking at, are ready to hatch. And that's why they look like being disintegrated. So this is actually a really cool picture photograph. You can see a lot of males and a few females, and some of the females actually have found recruited a male for the reproduction, and some of the males have not been successful. Um, and and you can also see, they are actually kind of swimming on the top of egg masses, right? So this is actually a fairly common sight. So a single egg mass or single raft of egg mass may actually contain egg masses from different copulating pairs. And this is also a very interesting situation. I have observed this in numerous occasions. Multiple males will compete with each other to mount a single female. You can see the single female's leg and then like about five, six males competing to mate with her. Really interesting situation. Actually, this is a close up of the same image. A single female can actually um, can be a resource for many males. So this competition, this kind of this um, the mating rivalry could actually go for several minutes, for several hours. I have seen sometimes these kind of these multi male aggregations for multiple lovers on a single vernal pool, and you can clearly see in this one that the female is much larger than the males. So ultimately, one of them is going to actually win, and then and the process where the male kind of piggybacks on the female is considered an amplexus. So he is wrapping his arms and legs around the female, and he is firmly grasping her. In fact, during the reproductive stage for many amphibians, the male limbs grow more robust and larger than the females. And ultimately, if the female, if she is receptive, she releases her eggs, and the male releases his sperms on the top of that. So the fertilization happens externally. And once it is done, they both go their own ways. They don't spend time in the vernal pool. Another species that occupy vernal pool habitats is this guy. That is the spotted salamander, one of the mole salamanders, right? Mole salamander, in fact, it's a family called Ambystomatidae, and this is one of the members of that family. A very common species, a beautiful species, another favorite species of mine. And they too occupy vernal pools. They do reproduce in vernal pool environments. Um, the the bottom left figure is an egg mass, possibly laid by a single female, right? And those egg masses are much larger and have a secondary coating around individual eggs. And the bottom right figure is a larvae of the spotted salamander. And you can see those beautiful, gorgeous external gills and the tail fin. Um, the top right figure is a single egg mass. And in that one, you can actually see um, salamanders developing, the larvae developing inside of them. It's really cool. In certain cases, you can see those highly developed embryonic stages moving inside the egg. And also, you might see a green color in that particular image. That green color is a symbiotic algae living inside of the egg of that particular egg mass. So inside that egg mass, those freshwater algae, they photosynthesize and share some of that food with the developing larvae. And the advantage for the algae is they actually have a substrate, the egg mass matrix, to grow on. It's a really interesting situation. Um, it's observed all over throughout the distribution of the spotted salamanders. Um, Previously, we talked about the migratory breeders of vernal pools, and let's now talk about different types of migratory breeders. First, early migrants. Now, um, these animals migrate and lay eggs either in late winter or in early spring in the vernal pool environment. So this could happen as soon as ice or snow in the wetland starts to melt. Now, the disadvantage of being an early migrant or early migratory breeder in vernal pool environment is that there's only little food available because you're kind of rekindling that particular vernal pool ecosystem as soon as the ice is melting. But the advantage is there's only few species that can breed very early in the season. So therefore, you get only little competition, right? And also, there is very few or no predators because predators usually come later on as the season progresses. Another disadvantage, or a rather better way to put it, is another environmental constraint is um, particularly in the Northeast, in the late winter or in early spring, the temperature is still cold. During every night time, you may undergo nocturnal freezing, maybe continuously or maybe intermittently. So those are environmental constraints. But the examples for these kind of early migrants, in terms of the amphibians, are going to be mole salamanders like the spotted salamander and the wood frogs. So these guys only undergo a single generation within a single season. For wood frogs, these generation cycles are quite short, like not more than a few months, a couple of months, but in terms of mole salamanders, it could be quite long. Um, it could be as long as starting from March all the way going up to August. Now, the second category, spring summer migrants. So, who performs migrations and breeding in vernal pool environments little later in the season. So, these guys are more adapted to breed in warm water, more adapted to develop in warmer water. So, because of its warmer water, kind of the development is faster. And because the water is relatively warmer and it's little late in the season, there's more food, natural resources available in the vernal pool by that time because the invertebrates may already have colonized and created the food base for amphibians in the vernal pool. Um, Examples are American toads, Fowler's toad, at least in northeastern United States, and great reef frogs are also a good example here. Um, Now these guys, lay eggs and immediately they hatch, um, and that hatching could be, triggered by water temperature, as well, or if the water temperature is still a little too cold, then the hatching could be delayed. Um, so these guys could actually complete multiple generations in the vernal pool, and also the diversity of spring summer migrants are quite high. The community of animals that are considered as spring summer migrants are quite high because there are more species that are adapted to breed in relatively warmer water conditions. And also it happens step by step. First species A comes in, then species B, then species C, like that. There is kind of a successional pattern of colonization of vernal pools by spring summer migrants as the season progresses. Now the third one will be fall migrants. So these guys lay eggs in the dry basin of the wetland, and the eggs are very desiccation resistant because imagine what I just mentioned. Okay, they lay eggs in the drier basin of the wetland when there is no water in the wetland, right? And so the eggs has to be resistant to desiccation. And what happens is, they remain dormant, in the dry basin, and immediately after flooding, it could be a fall rain, okay, or a fall snow melt. So after flooding, they could actually hatch and emerge as larvae. Or sometimes the hatching could be delayed until the spring season, right? So the hatching could be driven by temperature or photo period. The I will talk about examples next for each of these types.